The gun was in his own hands, and for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, Muhammad Ali stood in his Miami hotel room, pointing a loaded revolver at the mirror, watching his reflection hold death like it was just another opponent to face in the ring. It was February 1964. The night before he'd fight Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship, and something had broken inside him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the darkness he'd been outrunning since childhood. The weight of the weapon felt wrong and right simultaneously, cold metal against his palm, his finger resting near the trigger. Not quite touching, but close enough to feel the possibility. How does the man who claimed to be the greatest end up contemplating whether he wanted to see tomorrow? The room was a mess. Clothes scattered across the bed, newspapers spread on the floor with headlines predicting his death in the ring, half-eaten room service going cold on a tray by the window. Outside, Miami was alive with the noise of a city that didn't care whether Cassius Clay lived or died. Traffic sounds drifting up 7 floors to where he stood frozen in front of that mirror. He'd sent everyone away hours ago. Angelo Dundee, Bundini Brown, the hangers on who'd been filling his room with noise and distraction. Now it was just him and the reflection and the gun he'd taken from his bag, where he'd been keeping it hidden for 2 weeks. The mirror showed him everything he was supposed to be. Young, handsome, undefeated. 22 years old, with the world opening up before him like a flower. But the eyes looking back were someone else's, someone older and more tired, someone who'd been wearing a mask so long the face underneath had started to suffocate. The reflection's hand was steadier than his actual hand, which was starting to shake, making the gun's barrel waver slightly, a small movement that felt enormous in the silence of the room. What happens when the mask you wear becomes so heavy you'd rather die than keep holding it up? He'd bought the gun 3 weeks earlier in Louisville, walked into a shop on 4th Street like he was buying groceries, filled out the paperwork with his real name because Cassius Clay could still do things that Muhammad Ali would never be able to do freely. The clerk had recognized him, had made a joke about needing protection from Sonny Liston, and Clay had laughed, played along, done the thing he always did where he turned real fear into performance. But driving back to his hotel that day, the gun in a paper bag on the passenger seat, he'd felt something loosen in his chest, some pressure valve releasing because now he had an option, a way out if things got too heavy. The weight had been building for months, maybe years, maybe his whole life if he was honest about it. Being Cassius Clay meant being on all the time, being loud and funny and confident and quotable. Being the Louisville Lip who predicted rounds and wrote poems and made white reporters uncomfortable with how much space he took up. But alone in hotel rooms, the person who existed when nobody was watching felt like a completely different human being. Someone quiet and uncertain and terrified of being exposed as a fraud. Could you die from the gap between who people thought you were and who you actually felt like inside? Tomorrow he was supposed to fight Sonny Liston, a man who'd been beating people unconscious for years, a man with mob connections and a stare that made grown fighters reconsider their career choices. Everyone said Clay would die in the ring, that Liston would kill him, that this was a publicity stunt that would end with a stretcher and maybe a closed casket. The odds were 7-1 against him. Sports writers had written his obituary in advance. His own corner was terrified he'd get permanently damaged. And maybe that was easier than this, dying in the ring as Cassius Clay, forever young, forever the underdog who'd taken a chance. Better than living long enough for people to see through the act, to discover that behind all the bluster was just a scared kid from Louisville who didn't know if he was good enough, strong enough, real enough to be the thing he kept claiming he was. The gun felt heavier with each passing second, or maybe his arm was getting tired from holding it up. He'd lowered it slightly, barrel now pointing at his chest instead of his head, which seemed significant somehow, though he couldn't articulate why. The mirror showed him a man holding a gun, and he couldn't quite connect that image to himself, couldn't make it real despite the cold metal in his palm. How long had he been standing here? 5 minutes. 10. 20. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. The digital clock on the nightstand said 11:47 p.m., but he couldn't remember what time he'd picked up the gun. Couldn't reconstruct the sequence of events that had led from sitting on the bed reading horrible newspaper predictions to standing here contemplating whether he wanted to exist. The gap in his memory felt appropriate somehow. If he was going to erase his future, why not erase pieces of his present too? His mind drifted to his mother, Odessa, back in Louisville, probably praying for him right now, probably on her knees asking God to protect her baby from Sonny Liston's fists. What would it do to her to get a different kind of phone call, to learn her son had died not in glory, but in despair, alone in a hotel room with a gun that should have protected him, but instead became his executioner? The thought of her face when she heard the news made his stomach twist, made the gun feel like it was burning his hand. She'd always believed in him with a fervor that felt religious, had told him since he was 6 years old that he was destined for greatness, that God had plans for Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. That went beyond anything Louisville had seen before. When other mothers told their sons to be realistic, to get normal jobs, to accept their place in a world that didn't want them to rise, Odessa had pushed him toward boxing, toward excellence, toward a future that seemed impossible from their small house in the West End. What would it mean to her if that faith had been misplaced? If the son she'd believed in had been hollow all along? And his father, Cassius Sr., who'd named him after the white abolitionist, who'd filled his head with pride and anger in equal measure, who'd taught him that being black in America meant being twice as good and half as respected. Would his father understand? Would he see this as weakness or as the logical conclusion of a life spent fighting battles that couldn't be won with fists? His father had his own darkness, drowned it in alcohol most nights, came home loud and angry and unpredictable. Clay had learned early to read those moods, to know when to hide and when to endure, to understand that the man who painted signs for a living contained multitudes of rage that had nowhere safe to discharge. Maybe the darkness was hereditary, passed down through blood and example, a family legacy more reliable than money or property. What made a person reach the point where dying seemed easier than continuing? He'd thought about this before, more times than he'd ever admitted to anyone. Driving across dark highways after fights, looking at the center line and calculating how easy it would be to jerk the wheel, to make it look like an accident, to spare his family the shame of suicide. Standing on hotel balconies looking down at concrete and wondering if the fall would hurt or if unconsciousness would come quick. Taking pills for a headache and counting how many were in the bottle. Doing math he pretended was idle curiosity, but felt like contingency planning. The darkness came and went like weather, some days bright and manageable, other days pressing down so hard he could barely breathe under the weight of it. He'd learned to function through it, to put on the Cassius Clay show even when the person inside wanted to scream or cry or just cease existing. The performance had become so automatic he sometimes forgot which was real, the public persona or the private despair. There had been a day last month, after a training session, when he'd stood in the shower for 40 minutes letting water run over him until it went cold, unable to motivate himself to turn it off or get out. Just standing there, feeling nothing and everything simultaneously. Bundini had eventually knocked on the door asking if he was okay, and Clay had snapped back to performance mode, made a joke about conserving hot water for later, stepped out smiling like nothing was wrong. Why was tomorrow the breaking point when he'd survived so many other tomorrows? Maybe it was the finality of it, the understanding that after tomorrow everything would change one way or another. Either he'd beat Liston and have to keep being Cassius Clay at an even bigger, more exhausting level, or he'd lose and be exposed as exactly what he feared he was. All talk, all performance, all smoke and no substance. Both options felt unbearable. Both futures looked like prisons he didn't want to inhabit. And underneath it all, the secret he'd been carrying that made everything heavier. He'd been meeting with the Nation of Islam, listening to Malcolm X, considering conversion to a faith that would require him to reject the name his parents gave him, to become someone entirely new. That transformation felt necessary and terrifying in equal measure, like dying and being reborn, but having to stay conscious through the whole process. Malcolm had been talking to him about the nature of identity, about how the slave masters' names were chains that kept black people psychologically enslaved even after physical bondage ended. Cassius Clay was a white man, Malcolm had said. Why should you carry his name? Why should you honor a man who never knew you existed just because your ancestors were his property? The logic was sound, compelling even, but the emotional weight of rejecting his parents' gift felt like betrayal. They'd named him carefully, deliberately, choosing a white abolitionist as namesake because they'd wanted their son to bridge worlds, to be acceptable to white people while remaining proud of his blackness. But Malcolm argued that acceptability was just another cage, that true freedom required radical rejection of everything white supremacy had built. If he couldn't be Cassius Clay anymore and wasn't sure he could be Muhammad Ali, who was he? The question had been haunting him for weeks, keeping him up at night, making food taste like ash in his mouth. Identity wasn't supposed to be this complicated. You were who your parents named you, who your community recognized you as, who you'd been your entire life. But Malcolm made it sound like identity was a choice, something you could construct deliberately rather than inherit passively. And if identity was a choice, couldn't existence be a choice too? Couldn't he simply choose to stop, to exit, to decline the invitation to keep being whoever he was supposed to be? The gun was getting heavy. His arm ached from holding it up. He lowered it completely now, let it hang at his side, barrel pointing at the carpet. The hotel room carpet was beige, with ugly brown patterns, cigarette burns near the dresser, stains he didn't want to think about. This was where he might die, in a generic hotel room that looked like 10,000 other hotel rooms, alone at 20, too, with so much unlived life stretching out behind him like a road he'd never get to travel. Through the wall, he could hear a television. Someone watching a game show, laugh track echoing tinny and false. Someone was living a normal life just 15 feet away, eating chips maybe, not thinking about death or destiny, or whether they had the courage to face tomorrow. The normalcy of it felt obscene, offensive, like how dare the world keep spinning when he was standing here trying to decide whether to exist. He'd tried to explain the darkness to Bundini once, carefully, testing whether it was safe to let someone see behind the mask. They'd been in a car driving between cities, nobody else around, and Clay had said something about how sometimes he felt tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, tired in his bones, tired of being himself. Bundini had looked at him with concern and confusion, had started talking about rest and recovery, and maybe taking a few weeks off after the Liston fight. But that wasn't what Clay had meant, and he'd realized Bundini couldn't understand because Bundini didn't carry this particular darkness. Bundini had his own demons: alcohol, depression, disappearances where nobody knew where he was for days at a time. But Bundini's darkness looked different from Clay's, operated according to different rules, and the language they each had for discussing it didn't quite translate. What would Bundini say if he walked in right now and saw this? Bundini Brown, his cornerman and friend and the closest thing he had to a brother, who believed in Clay with a fervor that felt religious, who called him the greatest before anyone else did, who saw potential where others saw a loud kid who needed to learn his place. Bundini would probably take the gun gently, would sit Clay down, would start talking in that preacher voice about destiny and purpose and how the world needed what Clay had to offer. But Bundini wasn't here. Nobody was here. That had been intentional, sending everyone away, creating this space where he could make this decision without witnesses, without having to explain or justify or perform strength he didn't feel. The solitude had seemed necessary an hour ago. Now it felt like a trap he'd built for himself. Clay moved to the window, gun still in his hand, and looked down at Miami spread out below. Cars moving through streets, people walking. Everyone busy being alive without questioning whether they wanted to be. From up here they looked like ants, purposeful and simple, following paths that made sense to them. He envied their certainty, their apparent ease at existing. A couple was walking hand in hand on the sidewalk below, laughing about something. The sound drifting up, faint and distant. They had no idea someone 7 floors above them was contemplating death. Their joy existed completely independent of his suffering, which felt both comforting and lonely. The world would continue without him, but also the world would continue without him. He wouldn't be missed except by a small circle of people who'd grieve and then move on because that's what people did. Could anyone down there see him standing in this window holding a gun? The thought made him step back quickly. Sudden paranoia that someone would see, would call the police, would turn this private moment into public spectacle. That's all his life was now, public spectacle, private nothing. Every moment watched and commented on and judged. Even his despair couldn't be his own. If word got out that Cassius Clay was suicidal the night before the Liston fight, it would become a headline, a narrative. Another story people told about him that had nothing to do with his actual experience. He imagined the headlines. Clay cracks under pressure. Nervous breakdown before big fight. Eyes the Louisville lip all talk. The media would have a field day. Would use his moment of weakness as proof that they'd been right all along. That he was just a kid playing at being a champion. That Liston was going to expose him as a fraud. He sat down hard on the bed, gun resting on his thigh now, pointed at nothing. The mattress sagged under his weight. Springs creaked. Room service tray on the dresser mocked him with its cold French fries and congealed gravy. He'd ordered it 3 hours ago, had managed 2 bites before his stomach had closed up, appetite disappearing into the dark space where his certainty used to live. What did Sonny Liston feel the night before his fights? Probably nothing like this. Liston had been to prison, had survived things that would break most people, had built himself into a weapon that didn't question its own edge. Liston didn't stand in hotel rooms wondering if existence was worth the effort. Liston just was. Solid. Certain, dangerous, real in a way Clay couldn't access no matter how loud he talked or how many poems he wrote. Clay had studied Liston's background obsessively, had read every article, watched every fight, tried to find weaknesses in the man's armor. Liston had grown up in Arkansas, one of 25 children, beaten by his father with such regularity that running away to St. Louis as a teenager had probably saved his life. He'd turned to crime, served time for armed robbery, learned to box in prison because it was better than getting beat up by other inmates. The trajectory of Liston's life was brutally simple. Survive, get stronger. Hurt people before they hurt you. There was a purity to that narrative that Clay envied even as he recognized its tragedy. Liston had been forged by suffering into something unbreakable, while Clay felt like he was being shattered by success into something fragile. Maybe that's why everyone expected Liston to win. Not because of skill or power or experience, but because Liston was integrated in a way Clay wasn't. Liston didn't have this gap between public and private self. Liston was the same person in the ring and out of it. A man who'd survived hell and decided to become the thing people feared most. What would it feel like to be that solid, that certain, that real? Clay looked at the gun again, really looked at it. Smith & Wesson, .38, nothing fancy, just functional metal designed to end things quickly. 5 rounds in the cylinder. He'd loaded it carefully 2 days ago, handling each bullet like it mattered, like he was preparing for something ceremonial. Now those bullets represented 5 possible futures that would never happen, 5 versions of Cassius Clay that would be erased if he chose this exit. He thought about each bullet as a potential moment. The first might stop him from becoming heavyweight champion, the second from converting to Islam, the third from having children, the fourth from inspiring a generation, the fifth from learning what it meant to grow old. All those futures compressed into metal casings, sitting in a cylinder waiting for a decision. The phone rang, shrill and loud in the silence, making him jump, nearly dropping the gun. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the phone on the nightstand, black plastic receiver vibrating with each ring. 1 ring. 2. 3. 4. He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. What would he say? How would his voice sound? Would the person on the other end hear the death he was contemplating? 5 rings, 6, then silence. The caller gave up, probably Angelo checking on him, or Bundini, or one of the reporters who'd somehow gotten his room number and wanted a quote for tomorrow's paper. The quiet after the ringing felt louder than the ringing itself. Oppressive, like the room was holding its breath waiting for him to make a decision. Clay stood up again, started pacing, gun still in his hand, but pointing at the floor now, no longer actively threatening, just present and available. The room was small for pacing 6 steps one way, turn 6 steps back. His footsteps were muffled by carpet, but he could hear himself breathing, ragged and uneven, like he'd just done roadwork, instead of standing still contemplating death. Why was this so hard? People did this every day, made the calculation that living was more painful than dying, pulled triggers, stepped off ledges, found whatever exit seemed cleanest. But Clay's finger wouldn't move to the trigger. His arm wouldn't raise the gun back up. Some part of him, buried deep under the despair, was refusing to cooperate with this plan. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe even dying required a kind of courage he didn't possess. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a professional fighter, someone who got paid to face physical danger, unable to muster the nerve to end his own suffering because some primal instinct kept overriding his conscious decision-making. Or maybe it was hope disguised as hesitation, some stubborn biological insistence on continuing that bypassed rational thought. His body wanted to live even if his mind couldn't articulate why. Every cell was programmed for survival, fighting against his conscious desire to stop, creating this internal war between intention and instinct. He thought about the fight tomorrow, tried to imagine it in detail. The weigh-in had been chaos. He'd gone crazy, screaming at Liston, acting like he'd lost his mind. And everyone thought it was psychological warfare, but really it had been genuine fear spilling out in the only way he knew how to express it. The performance had served its purpose, though. People were talking about Clay's madness instead of Liston's power. Tomorrow in the ring, what would happen? The crowd would be enormous, maybe 15,000 people, all of them expecting to see him get destroyed. The lights would be bright, hot, making sweat pour before the first bell rang. Liston would come out looking like death itself, and Clay would have to dance, have to move, have to be faster and smarter and braver than he felt capable of being. And then what? Either victory or defeat, and neither option seemed worth the effort of getting there. Victory meant more responsibility, more pressure, more time being Cassius Clay when Cassius Clay felt like a costume that didn't fit anymore. Defeat meant humiliation, vindication for everyone who'd said he was all talk, proof that he was exactly the fraud he feared being. But somewhere between those two outcomes was a third possibility he hadn't considered: transformation. Not winning or losing, but becoming something else entirely through the process. Using the fight as a crucible where Cassius Clay died and someone new emerged. Someone who didn't need guns in hotel rooms because he'd found a different way to reconcile the gap between public and private self. Was that possible? Or just desperate optimism from a mind looking for any excuse not to pull the trigger? Clay walked back to the mirror, stood facing himself again. Gun at his side now instead of pointed at his reflection. The man looking back at him seemed younger than 22, almost childlike in his confusion and pain. But there was also something else in those eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or determination, or just the animal stubbornness of youth that refuses to accept endings, even when endings seem logical. He raised the gun again, but this time it felt different, less like a weapon and more like a test. Could he do it? Did he have it in him to pull the trigger, to end the story of Cassius Clay before it reached whatever conclusion was waiting? His finger moved to the trigger, rested there, applied the slightest pressure without actually engaging the mechanism. The moment stretched out, elastic and eternal. In his reflection, he could see every version of himself that had ever existed. The kid from Louisville who'd learned to box because someone stole his bike. The Olympic gold medalist standing on a podium in Rome. The young fighter who'd beaten everyone they'd put in front of him. The man standing in this hotel room holding a gun wondering if tomorrow was worth seeing. Which version was real? Which one deserved to continue? I'm going to fight tomorrow, he said out loud to his reflection, testing the words, seeing if they felt true. His voice sounded strange in the empty room, too loud and too quiet simultaneously, echoing off walls and dying in carpet. I'm going to fight Sonny Liston and I'm going to win. The words felt like a lie and a truth layered on top of each other, impossible to separate. Maybe that was okay. Maybe you didn't need certainty to keep living. Maybe you just needed enough doubt about dying to postpone the decision another day. Maybe courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite being terrified. He said it again, louder this time, trying to convince himself or summon it into existence through declaration. I'm going to beat Sonny Liston. I'm going to become heavyweight champion of the world. I'm going to be the greatest. The greatest. That's what Bandini called him, what he'd started calling himself even though it felt like hubris, like tempting fate, like setting himself up for a fall. But maybe hubris was just another word for hope, for insisting that you mattered even when evidence suggested otherwise, for refusing to accept the limitations that circumstance and society tried to impose. Clay lowered the gun again, opened the cylinder with shaking hands. The 5 bullets sat there, brass and lead, potential energy waiting to be released. He dumped them into his palm, felt their weight, their coldness, their terrible simplicity. 5 small objects that could end everything or change nothing depending on what he did next. He walked to the window, opened it wide, felt humid Miami air rush in carrying the smell of ocean and exhaust and possibility. The city noise got louder, cars honking, people talking, music from somewhere, the ambient sound of life continuing regardless of individual crisis. Without letting himself think too much about it, he threw the bullets out into the night one by one, heard them ping off something metal in the alley below, small sounds that represented enormous decisions. The empty gun went back in his bag, hidden under clothes where it would stay until he could figure out what to do with it. Not destroyed yet. He wasn't ready for that level of commitment to living. But defanged, made safe, turned from immediate threat into future possibility. The compromise felt appropriate somehow, leaving the door open just a crack while choosing not to walk through it tonight. How many other nights would he stand at this particular crossroads? He didn't know. Couldn't know. The darkness would probably come back. It always did. Weather patterns in his skull that followed no predictable schedule. But tonight, in this moment, with the Miami heat pressing into his hotel room and the fight just hours away, he'd chosen to see what tomorrow looked like. Not because he was certain it would be better, but because he was curious enough about the answer to postpone finding out what death felt like. The decision didn't feel triumphant or even particularly hopeful. It felt more like exhaustion, like he'd been fighting himself for hours and finally one side had gained a temporary advantage. Tomorrow he'd have to fight Sonny Liston. Next week he'd have to fight the darkness again. Next month he'd have to fight whatever other demons were waiting in hotel rooms and quiet moments. But tonight he'd survived himself, and that was something. Maybe not greatness, but survival had its own kind of valor, its own legitimacy as an accomplishment even if nobody ever knew about it. The phone rang again. This time he answered on the second ring. "Yeah, champ, where you been?" Bandini's voice, worried and relieved simultaneously. That particular combination of emotions that comes from caring about someone unpredictable. Bean calling you for an hour. "You okay?" "Yeah," Clay said, and surprised himself by meaning it, at least partially. The word felt true in some small, fragile way. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just needed to be quiet for a minute. Think I'm ready now." "Ready for what?" "Ready to show the world who I am." There was a pause on the other end, Bandini processing what he was hearing, trying to read between the words to whatever truth was lurking underneath. "That's my champ," Bandini said finally, warmth flooding through the phone line. "You gonna dance tomorrow, make Liston look like he fighting a ghost. You gonna float and sting and make everybody who doubted you eat their words." Clay smiled despite everything, felt some of the weight lift. "Float like a butterfly. he said, trying out the phrase they'd been developing, feeling how it sounded in his mouth. Sting like a bee. Bundini completed it, and together they'd created something that would follow Clay for the rest of his life, a mantra that would become inseparable from his identity. Simple words, but they contained a philosophy: beauty and danger, grace and violence, the ability to be multiple things simultaneously without contradiction. Maybe that was the answer he'd been looking for. Maybe the gap between public and private self wasn't a problem to be solved, but a paradox to be inhabited. Maybe you could be both Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali, both confident and terrified, both strong and fragile, both performing and authentic. Maybe wholeness wasn't about closing gaps, but about learning to exist in the spaces between contradictions. They talked for a few more minutes. Logistics for tomorrow. Last-minute strategy, Bundini's usual pep talk about destiny and greatness. Angelo got on the phone too, went over the game plan one more time, reminded Clay that Liston's power was real, but beatable if Clay stuck to the strategy they developed. The voices on the phone were grounding, pulling him back from the edge he'd been standing on, reminding him that he wasn't alone even when he felt isolated. When Clay hung up, the room felt less oppressive. The darkness was still there, hovering at the edges like smoke you couldn't quite disperse, but it had receded enough that he could breathe, could move, could imagine getting through the next day and the day after that. Not easily, not without effort, but possibly. Possibly was enough to work with. He ordered new room service. Hungry now, body asserting its needs, insisting on fuel for tomorrow. While he waited for food to arrive, he shadowboxed in front of the mirror, throwing combinations at his reflection, loosening muscles that had been tensed for hours. The movements felt familiar, grounding, connecting him to the part of himself that knew how to fight, that understood the language of fists and footwork and timing. Jab, jab, right hand. Slip, counter, move. The combinations flowed automatically, muscle memory accumulated over thousands of hours in gyms. This was the self he understood, the fighter who existed in motion rather than thought. When he was boxing, the gap between public and private disappeared because there was only the immediate present, only the problem of the opponent in front of him, only the solution written in footwork and angles and speed. Maybe that's why he'd become a fighter in the first place. Not for the glory or money or fame, but for those moments of complete presence when the voices in his head went silent and there was only the purity of physical problem solving. In the ring, questions about identity and purpose and whether existence was worth the effort became irrelevant. There was only survive, adapt, overcome. The room service arrived. A full meal this time, steak and potatoes and vegetables, protein and carbs and nutrients his body needed for tomorrow. He ate methodically, tasting nothing at first, but feeling strength return to his body with each bite. Halfway through the meal, his appetite actually kicked in, and he found himself genuinely hungry, eating with enthusiasm that surprised him given where he'd been an hour ago. How quickly the body rebounds when you give it permission to continue. How eager the animal self is to live when the conscious mind stops interfering. After eating, he felt more grounded, more real, more present in his body instead of floating somewhere above it contemplating existential questions that had no good answers. He took a shower, letting hot water wash away the sweat and fear and residue of the darkest hour, standing under the spray until the hotel's hot water started running cold. Outside, Miami kept living, indifferent to his crisis, car horns, sirens, music from a club somewhere, the ambient sound of a city that never completely slept. Inside, Cassius Clay toweled off and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. Different mirror, same face, same questions, but somehow the answers felt less urgent now, less final. He'd survived the night. That was something. Maybe not greatness, maybe not even strength, but it was continuation, and continuation was its own kind of victory. Somewhere in Louisville, his mother was probably still praying, rosary beads moving through her fingers, asking God to protect her baby from Sonny Liston's fists without knowing the real danger had been in this hotel room, had been her son holding a gun wondering if tomorrow was worth seeing. Somewhere in the city, Sonny Liston was probably sleeping easy, confident in his own invincibility, unaware that his opponent had already won the hardest fight before they even stepped into the ring together. Somewhere in his own head, the person who might become Muhammad Ali was waiting to be born. Not tonight. Tonight was too raw, too fragile for transformation, but soon. The seeds had been planted in conversations with Malcolm, in questioning everything he'd been taught to accept, in recognizing that identity could be chosen rather than inherited. But tonight, in this moment, Cassius Clay was alive. And that was enough. That had to be enough. He climbed into bed, turned off the lights, lay in darkness listening to Miami breathe outside his window. Sleep didn't come easy. His mind was still racing, still processing, still trying to make sense of the past few hours. But eventually exhaustion won out over anxiety, and he drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams filled with boxing matches that never ended and opponents who kept changing faces. What would tomorrow bring? Victory or defeat? Life or death? Transformation or destruction? He'd find out soon enough. For now, he had made it through the night, and that was its own kind of victory, its own kind of greatness. Invisible to everyone but himself. The gun was still in his bag, emptied but present, a reminder that the darkness never fully disappeared, that this was a battle he'd have to keep fighting probably for the rest of his life. But he'd won tonight. Against himself, against despair, against the voice that said stopping was easier than continuing. He'd thrown the bullets out the window and chosen tomorrow, not because tomorrow promised to be good, but because he was curious enough about what would happen to resist the gun's promise of certainty. And maybe that was enough. Maybe greatness wasn't about never feeling despair, but about surviving it, about getting up one more time than you got knocked down, about choosing to continue even when continuation felt impossible. Maybe being the greatest would eventually mean more than just boxing. Maybe it would mean this too. These invisible victories in hotel rooms when nobody was watching, these moments when you saved yourself because nobody else could. Would anyone ever know about tonight? About how close he'd come to ending everything before it really began? Probably not. This would remain his secret, buried deep where even Bundini couldn't see it, hidden behind the public persona of Cassius Clay, who feared nothing and nobody. But he'd know. He'd carry it with him into the ring tomorrow, this knowledge that he'd already faced death and chosen life, that Sonny Liston's fists were nothing compared to what he'd survived in this room. And maybe that would make all the difference. Maybe surviving yourself was the hardest fight, and everything else was just practice. Just warm up for the real battle that happened in quiet moments when the crowd went home and you were left alone with your thoughts and a gun and a decision about whether tomorrow was worth seeing. He'd seen it. He'd chosen it. Now he just had to live it, one day at a time, one fight at a time, one moment at a time, building a life from postponed deaths until eventually living became more automatic than questioning whether to continue. The darkness was still there, would always be there. But tonight he'd learned he was stronger than it. And that knowledge, fragile and new and hard won, was something he could build on. Something he could use tomorrow when he stepped into the ring with Sonny Liston and showed the world what Cassius Clay was made of. Not just speed and skill and showmanship, but something deeper. Survival instinct, stubborn hope, the refusal to quit even when quitting seemed like the most rational choice. That was greatness too, and tomorrow he'd prove it to everyone, but especially to himself, that he was capable of more than anyone imagined, including him. What comes after surviving yourself? Everything. Everything came after. And Cassius Clay, soon to be Muhammad Ali, was ready to find out what that meant.